This week on Talking Real, we finish our conversation with Bryan Greene from the National Association of Realtors discussing all modern issues related to fair housing.
If you thought part one was good, wait till you hear part two.
Welcome back to Talking Real, brought to you by the Oklahoma Association of Realtors. This is episode 168 of Talking Real, back in the studio with Jeff and Nabil. Nabil, how's your day today?
Day's going fantastic. How's your day going?
My day is just wonderful, Nabil. I couldn't be having a better day than today.
That is brilliant. That's what I like to hear.
Sometimes you got to just say it and you got to make it happen. It's got to take control.
Got to manifest your own reality.
Absolutely. That's what we're doing today. We're manifesting a fantastic day. So, I'm excited. This is part two of our conversation with Bryan Greene, where we get to finish up talking about all these modern day current issues in fair housing and everything that's going on in the world of fair housing nationally and everywhere. So this is, again, a great conversation. We're excited to bring it to you. We hope that you've listened to last week's. If you haven't, you do need to go back and listen to last week's episode, part one with Bryan Greene. Get you caught up on being ready for today's episode so that we can finish up that full conversation on all things fair housing.
That's right. And before we jump back into that conversation, a couple of quick notes. Next week on Wednesday, May 19th, is Realtor Day at the Capitol. It's in person at the Capitol. We will gather at the Capitol View Event Center beforehand for some lunch, and I believe we're going to have some great food trucks out there. So it's going to be a little different than your typical catered lunch.
Yeah.
After which we'll make our way to the Capitol. Obviously, we'll have ice cream there. But this gives you a chance to meet with your legislators, build that rapport, build that one-to-one connection with them. And, that's it. It's pretty easy.
Yeah.
So you should go on over to OKRealtors.com/Capital Conference and get signed up.
Absolutely. The next thing is GRI coming up June 2nd and 3rd in Tulsa. So we're going on up to Tulsa for this module of GRI. I'm excited. I'm going to teach a little bit of contracts class. So if you're interested in hearing from me about contracts, you definitely want to join in there. But there's lots of other great.
Who
doesn't want to hear that? But everybody, all realtors, they really do love talking about contracts and stuff.
So it's important.
Absolutely. So I'm excited to do it, going through all the current contract forms, those kinds of things. But lots of great instructors are going to be there, and it's in person. Now I think you can watch, you can do it via Zoom online. We're doing a little bit of a hybrid thing is what we've been doing. So check that out. But man, I really hope you guys will join us in person. Our last GRI module got to teach, me and Paul Dismang taught one day and part of a second day, and we were in person. And if you've seen before, we've been doing so many things online, but finally getting to do it in person, man, the energy is just so much different.
Right.
It's just so much more fun. Everybody's getting tired of Zoom. So I hope that you guys will come join us for GRI June 2nd and 3rd. And if you bring a friend, you can get a discount. So go check that out as well. You can get signed up at OKRealtors.com/events and come join us in June.
That's right.
So now let's just jump in with our part two conversation of fair housing issues with Bryan Greene.
Here we go.
Always uncomfortable when you look at your Google Maps history.
Exactly.
Facebook sends you a notice that it looks like somebody uploaded a picture of you, and it's you're in the background of some photo and it recognized you. It's the crazy
Amazing.
What they're doing now.
Yeah.
So
you mentioned there's probably a lot of work to be done on the online advertising tools. Cause I was just thinking about Facebook in particular. If we're focusing on one entity, they've limited how you can target real estate ads and how you promote houses for sale and things like that. But I wonder how far it'll go, because obviously there's still Facebook groups, there's different pages, and groups and pages are not demographically or racially, I'm trying to think of the right word, protected in a sense, right? They can be very explicit in the group and the demographic that's in there. So, I wonder if that's going to extend to, hey, you can't post ads in this page, or you can't post this link in this group. How far does that go?
So I think with the law, I know with the law, you're dealing with two issues. You're dealing with the individual who created the ad and published the ad, and then you're dealing with the publisher. So I think it's very possible that if the publisher is not restricting where the ad goes, that they may be shielded, right? If they had nothing to do with where the advertiser decided to place the ad, the fact that the publisher has groups or affinity groups or forums or whatever, that's not a problem in and of itself. Now, if the advertiser has decided, when I advertise my housing, I make sure it's going to just be advertised to these people. In a sense, you're not dealing with anything any differently than you were dealing with in the 1970s, right? If someone had decided, hey, I'm going to just advertise in the Hispanic newspaper or the African American newspaper and not in any general publications, someone could allege that you are limiting that advertising based on race. So I think that's the issue that you're always going to deal with if people, as advertisers or housing providers, aren't advertising their housing generally. So someone has to allege it, someone has to know that you're doing that, or allege that you're doing that, and then a fact finder will look at it.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So I want to change gears again. You mentioned earlier when we were getting started about some discrimination in the LGBTQ arena. And as we know, NAR's added into Article 10 of the Code of Ethics that gender identity and sexual orientation are essentially protected classes under our Code of Ethics, although not necessarily explicitly a protected class under federal law at this time. But, I've seen some cases start to develop more in the employment law arena where courts have looked at sexual orientation, gender identity, and considered those as sex discrimination, which is a protected class. But I'm less, I've seen less in the housing arena. So what developments are going on there in terms of maybe some federal protection for LGBTQ, sexual orientation, gender identity? What are we seeing coming down the pipeline in that area? Because I'm telling people at this point that you better not be discriminating against people on that basis. One, it's not just a violation of the Code of Ethics, but you're going to be the test case because it's going to be federally protected. If it's maybe already is, but I'm kind of interested to hear on what's going on there.
So, very good question again. So you're absolutely right that it's not currently protected under federal law. Depending on where you are, it may be protected under state laws or local laws. It's possible. I don't believe Oklahoma prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation under state law. I don't know if there are localities that prohibit it, but even in the absence of such legal or statutory prohibitions, HUD 6 years ago, for example, was investigating cases of sexual orientation and gender identity as sex discrimination. And there was a question at that time whether or not a court would agree with that interpretation. Now, what has since happened is last year, the Supreme Court decided an employment discrimination case called Bostock, where the court concluded that that sex discrimination encompassed gender identity and sexual orientation under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That's the act that prohibits employment discrimination. And almost immediately, most legal scholars and certainly fair housing advocates said that then likely is going to prohibit such discrimination under sex under the Fair Housing Act, because Title VII, the Employment Anti-Discrimination Law, and Title VIII, the Fair Housing Act, have typically been interpreted together, and their definitions have generally been understood to be comparable. And so if it's prohibited under Title VII employment, it's almost certainly going to be recognized as recognized by the courts as being prohibited under the Fair Housing Act. And then the Biden administration came in and said they want all federal agencies to look at this Bostock decision and their civil rights regulations and determine how it influences them. And then almost immediately, HUD said, yeah, we looked at it and we interpret sex discrimination to cover gender identity and sexual orientation under the Fair Housing Act. So as of today, if you experience such discrimination in Oklahoma, you can file a complaint with HUD and HUD will investigate it. And if they find evidence of discrimination, they will charge it before a HUD administrative law judge. And you can elect to have it heard in federal court. And the federal courts, I think, would also likely interpret the law to cover it because of the Bostock decision. That still is not as good as having an actual federal law that prohibits discrimination against LGBTQ plus persons. And that's what we hope the Equality Act will provide. NAR supports the passage of the Equality Act. There's also other legislation which we have seen in the past and which will likely be offered again that's more narrow and focused on housing that we would likely support if we can get that prohibition against such discrimination specifically in the Fair Housing Act. So I think I want to say the train has left the station in terms of interpretation, and it just may be a more ironclad train if we can get the federal laws amended.
Yeah, it'd be so much simpler if it was just explicit. I mean, but anyone who's followed any kind of history of civil rights developments, particularly in the courts, is they have often had to sort of shoehorn protections into areas that would be so much easier if it just explicitly said it, as opposed to the courts having to come clean up some messes and fit them in.
I can hardly imagine it going the other direction. So I think the advice you're giving people is right.
Yeah, I know I wouldn't want to be that test case.
Right.
It's like, why? Yeah. And actually, that case is interesting. That was one of those, as a lawyer, got really nerded out on the analysis of it. And it's actually really solid analysis, I feel like. I mean, it makes complete sense that if you're going to consider someone's gender identity or sexual orientation, that necessarily underlying issue is that you have to consider their sex, and you're discriminating on that underlying analysis of what their sex is. And I'm like, that actually makes quite a bit of sense. That's
right. You're making a judgment or a determination of how that person should act or represent themselves based on their sex.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. Everybody go read that Bostock opinion.
I'm wondering if I'm going to do that now.
I mean, maybe. I don't know. You got to be a pretty good one like me to want to do that. To get in there.
You just read the caption.
Read the Wikipedia page.
Right,
where are the Spark Notes? Anyone remember those?
There you go. So, man, we've had a lot here. We've spent a lot of time. Man, I could just keep going, but we are kind of running out of time here. So we do want to maybe give an opportunity. Give us something that you're just optimistic about in the fair housing arena. We always like to end on a positive note and a good note. So something you're excited about that realtors should be aware of that's going on in fair housing, because we can talk about a lot of the problems, those kinds of things, some of the issues and how that's working. But we always like to have an opportunity to talk about something positive as well.
Yeah, well, I think people are just more interested in this subject than they've ever been. And I can tell you that this month, I probably have spoken to 40 associations just this month. And I took a week off for spring break for my children. So, so there's definitely great interest in the subject. And I think it's shifted. People's approach to fair housing has shifted from thinking just about risk, like what, might get me into trouble, to, what is the right thing to do, and, how much more can I do? I mean, I've been impressed at how many people have been calling, like looking to do all kinds of affirmative things to compensate for history that they now understand. So I think that speaks volumes, that people are putting together the history, and they recognize that we haven't all had the same opportunities under the law or in practice, even after changes in law, and people are embracing the principles of fair housing. And I think that's great, because we launched a program last year called ACT, ACT exclamation point. And it was an effort to more comprehensively deal with the discrimination that still occurs. And we said that we're going to stress accountability, culture change, and training. That's how you get that acronym. And I've always said, well, yes, accountability means the stick. You got to have a stick. And the stick has not been strong enough or big enough in the past. And the training, of course, we've been doing for decades, and perhaps it hasn't been as effective, and we need to do better training. And we've launched some really exciting, innovative training, like this thing, Fair Haven, that's out there that people enjoy. And it's good if we can make training enjoyable. But I've always said the culture is really where the play is, that if you can get people to embrace it, to like really get it and appreciate it and see how it benefits us as a society, to treat everyone right and make sure that all people who are credit worthy have opportunity, that's what's ultimately going to change the country, not the stick alone, and not just the knowledge. It's going to be people want to do it, and right now I see more people want to do it.
So what are one or two of those things that realtors should be doing or can be doing to promote fair housing in their communities?
So, I think for one, they need to recognize that we all have bias, and that it can creep into transactions unwittingly. So I think it's very important when you're dealing with, transactions to have like some kind of guide. I don't mean necessarily a written guide, but, in your mind, note that there are certain things you want to cover with everybody, and make a point of doing that. One of the things that we've seen is agents could get into conversations about schools and crime and resale values, and sometimes those agents are having those conversations with people who look like them. Let's say if you're a white real estate agent, you're telling white buyers about this kind of thing, and then when a Native American or Hispanic or buyers of different background comes in, suddenly you're not having that conversation. Maybe because you were maligning schools that were predominantly Hispanic, and now you discover like, oh, I better not say those are bad schools over there, or you're not recognizing that this person is also engaging this transaction for financial reasons and cares about resale as much as the next person. And so some of these conversations, some people might be engaging in innocently, but not equally, and so being aware of this and making sure that you've got sort of a spiel that you stick to with everybody is helpful, and might actually help you see that. But beyond that, we just see more and more agents showing leadership in their communities and trying to find ways to rectify the past. They're looking at the past of their communities, and even if they don't have the immediate solutions in hand, I think having a recognition of what's happened makes them better leaders. And we've been trying to profile some of these agents. We've now created on nar.realtor a little area where we highlight real estate champions, and we profiled some of them in a program on April 15th. That program is up there on the website too with Marcia Fudge and the MLK Memorial Foundation. But we're going to keep profiling agents out there in the community because we think that we all can learn from each other when it comes to this important topic of fair housing.
That's fantastic. All good stuff. And I love your perspective that we have to change the culture. Like that's what it comes down to. We can know what the requirements are. We can be trained on that. We can have enforcement, but it really does boil down to people wanting to do the right thing. And, the more we do talk about these issues, like I said, there's more people wanting to talk about them. We just this year launched our diversity and inclusion committee for the first time at the state level. And so we're trying to get that off the ground and figuring out, how that's going to play into the association. But people are wanting to have these conversations, like you said, just and broader, not just in realtors, but just sort of broadly in the nation. It feels like there's more discussion about these things, and that creates turbulence, right? We see that, that's the reality, but the hope that culture continues to shift in a positive direction. And I'm an optimist. I think that it will. And I do appreciate that perspective and the fight that NAR is having now of pushing these things like the Equality Act that you talked about, all these kinds of things that NAR is leading the charge, which this is my little pitch then, like, this is why we need to invest in RPAC. This is why we need to have members who are active and engaged, because that voice is strong. And if we can express that to not just our legislative leaders, state, local, national, but just to our clients, to everybody, that's how that culture starts to change. So, and leading the fight there, and I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot. And, I know this is the 100th year anniversary of those events in Tulsa, right? And I know more Oklahomans are learning that history. And I think it's sort of an example of how we shouldn't run away from the past. We shouldn't bury it. We don't always know the immediate solutions or how just the immediate relevance of those issues today. But usually when more people are talking about those things, it allows for that sort of creativity and that thoughtfulness to fashion solutions that help move us forward. So I just think it's good, that people are talking about these things, and good will come of it. We shouldn't be scared of it.
I agree.
That's true.
I appreciate it. Bryan, do you want to put out any contact information? How people maybe you're like, oh my gosh, I just talked to 40 associations. I don't have any time. I know. Right? So you're welcome to defer, but give you an opportunity to maybe pitch your wares a little bit. How can people see what you're up to at NAR?
I know. Maybe if I can give people a snail mail address, it'll get there slower. So
here's my fax number.
right. Yeah. Well, you can always reach me at NAR, and our emails are pretty straightforward. B is my first initial, and then Greene with an E at nar.realtors, where you can find me. But a lot of what you'll want probably is also on our webpage now. We've got a very informational webpage, chock full of resources at nar.realtors/fair housing. And there's so much content that we still want to put up there. And so I'm like looking at this and saying, all right, when Fair Housing Month is over, April we're in right now, I want to, find other ways we can get resources up there in searchable fashion. So that's something that we really want to do. One final thing, Walter Mondale, who was the co-sponsor of the Fair Housing Act, died this month, and he authored the Fair Housing Act with Edward Brooke in 1968. And I just want to say that he's a great American, and I had the great pleasure of meeting him when I worked at HUD. We brought him in to speak about the Fair Housing Act. And I think one of the most powerful things he said is that of all the civil rights laws, this is the one that has the potential to be the most transformational, but that to date we really haven't realized its promise. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, of course, did away with segregated facilities. The 1965 Civil Rights Act guaranteed that people of all backgrounds could vote. All of those promises have been well realized. But when it comes to the goals of the 1968 Fair Housing Act and vanquishing discrimination and making segregated communities a thing of the past, we still have a ways to go. So let's keep Vice President Mondale in our hearts, and let's keep working at this goal that he envisioned.
It's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Bryan. We really appreciate your time today. Super valuable. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that maybe we can have you back again sometime in the future and continue this conversation that's going to have to continue on into the future.
Yeah, I'd love it. Jeff, Nabil, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Bryan.
Thank you.
I so much appreciate Bryan taking the time to come talk to us. Again, fair housing is one of my favorite topics to talk about, learn about, and discuss, and just really dive into.
And ponder over.
Absolutely. And so I think this was a very helpful and insightful conversation into some of the things going on right now on fair housing, right? We can talk about the history, and I think that is vitally important. We can talk about all the legal requirements, which I think is of utmost importance, but also just staying on top of what the conversations and issues and things that are going on right now is really important. So I appreciate Bryan coming to share his expertise from his work with HUD and now his work with the National Association and everything that they're doing on fair housing policy.
Right. And just to echo what you were saying, I think it's so important because it's such an evolving process. It's fair housing is not static. It's always evolving. And so it's important to have these conversations and stay on top of it, like you were saying.
Yeah, because anybody who thinks that, well, we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968 and we've got HUD and it's fine. Everything's
right. We're done.
Right. Housing is now fair. You're fooling yourself, right? If that's what you think, then I'm sorry, but you are not paying attention. And so it is absolutely important that every realtor be educated on fair housing and what the current issues are and how things are changing and what our obligations are, because again, it's our job to make sure that we are providing a fair and equal housing opportunity for all people, all communities. And so it's an important thing, and that we as realtors are on the front line. And so we're that first line of defense as well to violations. So we got to make sure we're doing our job.
Indeed, we do. And if you found these conversations helpful or insightful, share this podcast with a friend who you think it might help as well.
Absolutely. And if you have any other questions related to fair housing or any other subject, go ahead and send us an email to podcast@OKRealtors.com, because we would love to answer any questions that you have that maybe came to your mind after listening to these last couple episodes. So, can't wait to hear from you. And in the meantime, until next time, we'll see you next Tuesday on Talking Real.